my contention is that's not right. He didn't start off as a natural contemplative of someone who loved solitude and who loved that chance to be away and to reflect and pray. If you look at what the sources say about him, his whole life was focused on being the center of attention. I mean, you look at all the things that they talk about. I mean, even when he had parties, why did he throw parties? Well, part of it was to enjoy the food and the drink, but that's not really what he was after. He was after everybody telling him what a wonderful party he was throwing, how great he was. And in fact, if you look at one of the sources, it's real interesting. He says sometimes he would wear clothes that were strange, like half sackcloth and half silk. You know, and all these things. Why? Because he didn't want the center of attention to move away from it. And I think that that was something that he struggled with all his life. Because what is one of the main things Francis was always struggling against? Vainglory. That temptation to make himself the center of everything. And he may have lost some of that temptation when he first, had his conversion and everybody was throwing rocks and stones at him. But soon enough, they were all calling him a saint, and he had the same temptation to really believe that that was him, that the whole world was meeting their door to him because of him. And so because of that, we look at Francis's life and we say he was a contemplative. I mean, he did spend much time. We know, somebody, how did they figure it out? Half a year, maybe even 2/3 of a year sometimes, in hermitages, way up in the mountains, going in the forest, islands in the middle of lakes, wherever he could find to be alone. He became that. He entered into that. But I don't think he entered into that because that was his natural inclination. He entered into that because he knew he needed to. He knew that if he did not spend a lot of time focusing on God and who God is, remember that famous prayer, who are you and who am I? And Francis knew that if he did not spend time focusing on that, then the temptation he would have when he was out preaching and everybody was running to him would have been too great. And he would have started focusing on himself. So what I think this means for us is, first of all, there is some way to be formed in a contemplative spirit. There is some way to learn that. It's not something that we just have to depend on. Well, it has to be completely natural to a person. It can be learned. On the other hand, I want to reflect for a moment on Bonaventure. Because Bonaventure, for all that he admired Francis, and of course he did very much, Bonaventure was a natural contemplative, I think. From the little bit that we know about him, I think Bonaventure was a natural contemplative. It's not an accident that he ended up at the University of Paris, and he settled very nicely in, after he joined the order, into the life of a professor. Which, yes, had some of its active aspects, but basically was a contemplative life. You would have your disputes, and you could have your time of prayer, and you had a very nice rhythm going on. And we know that while Bonaventure was at the University of Paris, and while he was living his life, he came up with little insights and things. He came up with things. He was very connected with the Lord. But I think if you look at Bonaventure's life, he didn't make the breakthroughs that we remember him for, the precious things that he's given us in theology and spirituality, until he was taken out of that atmosphere and made the minister general. And I don't know if we always remember what a traumatic experience that must have been for him. Here he was at the University of Paris, and yes, there were these, controversies at the university and everything, but still, it was this very enclosed life, this very nice cloistered life. And all of a sudden, he's made minister general, and he has to visit the order all over Europe, and he finds out what life among the brothers is really like. Some of which is wonderful, but as you remember maybe from his first encyclical letter to the whole order, he found some things that weren't quite so good, such as the fact that most people would rather meet a thief on the road than a friar. And then there were so many, there were those things going on. Bonaventure was taken and put into that cauldron. And a few years of that made him desperate. Because if you look at the beginning of the Itinerarium, he tells us, he says, moved by the example of our most blessed Father Francis, I eagerly desired this peace. If you read the prologue the itinerarium, he's focusing on Francis. What does he focus on? Peace. Francis was this vessel of peace, the peace of God, the peace of the heavenly Jerusalem. And what he says is, I was looking for this peace. I was moved by divine inspiration, withdrew to Mount Laverna, since it was a place of quiet. And there I wished to satisfy the desire of my spirit for peace. And of course, it was during that retreat, that time on Mount Laverna, that he was inspired to write what would eventually, he would eventually finish the itinerarium, the journey of the mind, of the soul, of the heart into God. And he came down from that mountain and still worked as Minister General. I always think that maybe that letter of Francis, to the minister, remember he says, you want a hermitage, well, you don't get one. I think that would apply to Bonaventure. He probably would have loved to have stayed up there and said, oh, now I've got this beautiful vision. But he didn't. He went back and he continued in that role of Minister General, but in that deepening spirituality, that deepening contemplative vision of God. So in Bonaventure we have someone that naturally was contemplative, and that was a great gift, but who also needed how to temper and broaden that contemplative vision within the life of the friars, and within the active life of the order. So what I think this means, just reflecting on those two, is that yes, formation for contemplation, formation in contemplative spirit is very important, but it means multiple things. And it always is part of our Franciscan life. And what I'd like to do is just, again, offer some reflections now on what we are being told and what we're called to reflect on in this contemplative spirit in our day.